Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Eon Podcast. We have been joined today by Azad Essa, who has been a journalist for Al Jazeera covering US foreign policy. He's covered the length and breadth of Africa and he has also reported from Kashmir. Currently, he's at the Middle East Eye and he's been studying and researching the relationship between India and Israel. As a general, the US foreign policy impacts on the Middle East and the Muslim world, but specifically, you've been researching about the relationship between India and Israel, which is culminated in the book Hostile Homelands. You guys can get it. Where can they get it?
Liberty.
Liberty. You can get it in Liberty Books, right? And then we'll also link the social media platforms where people can reach you out on. Azad, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. So now we've established that you've been covering this subject, and there seems to be a lot of misconceptions and false notions in Pakistan and generally in the narrative with regards to the relationship between India and Israel. And a lot of that has come into question since the recent conflict started. Is there a historical relationship all the way back to the Nehruvian India, or is this a modern sort of Hindutva-based phenomenon that we're witnessing with the increased cooperation? Everyone knows the meme. India has full support, sir, for Israel, and where does that come from? Is this just IT bot farming coming from the Hindutva right? Is this anti-Muslim hate, or is there a deeper, more political, diplomatic connection?
Yeah, so the story of the India-Israel relationship starts prior to the states of India, or Israel coming to being. So our impressions of the relationship a lot of the time is based off what Nehru and what Gandhi originally said in the 30s and early 40s about Zionism, about Palestine, and their ideas about this Jewish state that might come into being, right, was really, framed around the fear of imperialism taking root in the Middle East. And so Gandhi and Nehru looked at the project of this Jewish state encroaching onto Palestine as an imperial project. And so that pretty much becomes the backbone, in a way, of the Indian National Congress's foreign policy. But more than that, it also becomes the way in which people see India's foreign policy when India actually becomes a state in 1947. So what I mean by this is that these statements are made in the 30s, in the early 40s. The Holocaust takes place, and Israel comes into being in 48, and India comes across as being extremely pro-Palestine because of those statements that these leaders made, prior to the states
during their colonial occupation.
During the colonial occupation, making the connections between the British in the Indian subcontinent
And the British
as well
mandate
as
in
British,
Palestine.
right? However, the what people miss is that when India becomes a state, it adopts a foreign policy that suits its interests. It's not a foreign policy that's based on some moral impulse, as they want us to believe. So what I mean by that is, firstly, India needs oil, it needs energy. So it needs to look to the Arab world to get these resources. So it knows that if it takes Israel's side, or it becomes too cozy with Israel, it might compromise the ability to get those resources. Then there's also the case of the partition that takes place in the subcontinent, and India the Indian National Congress sees the partition as a failure, right? And so they don't want the Arab world to move towards Pakistan in terms of friendship, in terms of being cozy, as well as on the question of Kashmir, because the Arab world is very familiar about what's taking place in Kashmir at the time, and so the Indian government don't want the Arab world to move towards.
So it's a tightrope walk where they want to maintain the PR of supporting the idea of a Palestine, but they don't want to ruin diplomatic relationship in the Middle East or with Israel.
Yeah, and then the third part is that the Indian government recognized as well that there's a certain currency in being seen as pretty much anti-empire, anti-imperial at the time. So Palestine becomes that issue in which if you choose to support Palestine or the idea of a Palestinian state or Palestinians in general, and if you oppose the Israelis, then you are basically on the right side of history, essentially. So there's a currency to that, and that helps them when it comes to the non-aligned movement, when it comes to all of the other things that take place. The 50s
The
and
foreign
60s.
policy posturing, it fit into that narrative, so it was convenient at that time.
But to answer your question, the larger question, because there are so many questions within the question, is that in the 50s, you have the non-aligned movement meeting in 55 and then in 61. But many people don't know that Nehru actually wanted Israel at the non-aligned movement meetings in Bandung, in Indonesia, originally. But it was Pakistan and the Arab world that did not want Israel there, so that Israel doesn't come. But India, as one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, then basically take credit for Israel not being at Bandung and not being part of the non-aligned movement. Then in the 60s, India goes to war with China, and it needs armaments, and it is struggling on the Himalayan mountains. So it sends out a series of letters to different parts of the world, including to Ben Gurion. Israel at the time does not have diplomatic ties with India. But India, despite that, India sends a message to David Ben Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, and asks for help. He replies and offers assistance. And so Israel starts assisting India with regards to military, in terms of military supplies,
Right.
from 62. And then, even though they don't have a diplomatic relationship. And then that continues in 65 in the war against Pakistan. It continues in 71 in the war against Pakistan again. And interestingly, Israel is one of the first countries that actually recognizes Bangladesh in 71.
Yes.
Now,
Even though Bangladesh refuses to recognize it.
even though Bangladesh refuses to recognize it. So that relationship in the 70s also continues, in that you have this weird thing where India becomes publicly more and more antagonistic towards Israel. It becomes the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO. It supports the UN resolution that calls Zionism racism, in the mid-70s as well. But privately, it's actually expanding ties between Mossad and RAW. It's getting officials, Indian army officials being trained by the Israelis. So behind the scenes, a lot of talk and a lot of exchanges taking place.
Military
But
technologies,
publicly, yeah, but publicly, there's a big disconnect, between the two countries, and so we see all of these images of Yasser Arafat and Indira Gandhi. He called her my sister. All of this. There's a lot of rhetoric, and it's part of that Indian soft power story, presenting yourself or projecting yourself in a particular way. And in the 80s, they also become closer as India starts moving towards, joining the global capitalist economy. And in 92, with the Cold War ending, you have normalization of ties. And then basically the floodgates open. So that relationship that we see today is pretty much the top of a building whose infrastructure or the foundation was built already.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
Tip of the iceberg.
80% of it is below water.
Yeah.
In the past 70, 80 years, it's been
Yeah.
developed. Secret diplomatic ties, secret cables, military aid, military technology, trainings, and even spy networks. And today it would translate into the form of a Pegasus, maybe, for example.
Yeah, the foundation is completely built up over the 60s, 70s, and 80s period, and it's the Congress Party that facilitates that. And so the only thing, the difference between Manmohan Singh perhaps and Modi is that Manmohan Singh wouldn't want to be seen with an Israeli official, right? But Modi embraces the ideology of the Israeli state.
Yeah, Manmohan Singh would probably hold a Palestinian tote bag or something.
Yeah, well, this is Priyanka Gandhi,
Yes.
right, was holding a tote bag in Parliament, but it's her grandmother essentially that
And her party.
creates relationships between Mossad and RAW. So the
Yes.
whole thing is just like
It's farcical.
it's farcical, yeah.
So basically, across the Indian political spectrum, we can glean from this, there is a partiality towards the state of Israel in sharing military technologies, in sharing espionage capabilities and training officers. You have this clear relationship, but they're not overt with this relationship because they don't want to push the Muslim world to Pakistan in the matter of Kashmir, especially. They don't want to damage their oil and energy needs potentials in the Arab world. Do you think Modi is a symptom of things like the Abraham Accord, the attitude India has now? Is it because of the Arab world's normalizations of Israel, or is it that India is sort of leading the charge there?
So that's a great question, because by my estimate, I think that the relationship essentially was fast tracked because of the Abraham Accords. So arms sales today is essentially around $2 billion per year. That means that India buys around 46% of all weapons that Israel sells to the world, right? And that's a dramatic stat if you think about it. In terms of the Abraham Accords, what the Abraham Accords did essentially was that, it allowed Modi to become closer to Israel and ensure that there will be no blowback from the Arab states. And I think that's where your question essentially points towards. So you have the UAE and Saudi moving towards, well, in the UAE's case, normalization has taken place. But you have the Arab world moving towards normalization. So it means that India has no reason to be fearful that there'll be any kind of repercussion.
Right.
So when the Abraham Accords took place, this is when you have things like Pegasus and things like more connections with regards to AI and India developing Israeli weapons on Indian soil. These things start accelerating at a scale that we've never seen.
No, even the labor exports now, India is sending over workers into Israel to help build infrastructure. They're working in construction, even down to like the proper laborial class.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have there's so many streams to this relationship now. You have a technological stream, you have an agricultural stream, in terms of, Israel presents itself or projects itself as a kind of, making the desert bloom. Right?
Yeah.
And so it sells this
image
of image.
Irrigation technology.
Absolutely, right. And
which
so
it's primarily taken from Australia, by the way.
And it's also stolen water as well from the Palestinians as well. So you steal their resources, you project yourself as having these gadgetry, right? So it's essentially fabricating a sense of superiority. And so you go to a place like India, and then you sell these ideas to the state, and the companies buy into these ideas because it means basically decimating the local ecology and the local demography, and then you have to buy into their solutions.
Yes.
Right? So it's a very capitalistic enterprise.
And of course, the people buy it up because Israel has beautiful women.
Well, maybe. But
you know what I'm talking about, right?
No. Well, there is this. That's also part of Israeli soft power as well.
The projection of the women.
There's
and it's specifically for an Indian audience, primarily.
Not necessarily.
I'm messing with you.
But ultimately, the
idea of honey traps are not just for the Indians.
The IDF?
Honey traps online are not just for the Indians.
No, it's about projecting Israel in a particular light as well.
Women friendly,
sexualization of the forces as well,
to make it exotic and
absolutely. And so the streams have now come to the point where there's a diplomatic front with regards to India's support of Israel, in terms of how India votes at the UN as well. And now as you mentioned, with the workers coming in, these workers are going to replace Palestinian workers. So now there are 16,000 Indian workers actively replacing. So they're actually part of the genocide that's taking place.
Yes, so for the sake of the audience, the occupied territories usually were a source for cheap labor, which was the only labor the only jobs that those people could have, that they would be forced to work under for Israeli farms, occupied farms, and the other such works. Even those jobs are now going to be given to Indian immigrants, and it's part of the sort of replacement, the economic replacement of any potential that Palestinians had in the occupied territories as well. What about the relationship on Kashmir? Because where does Israel stand on the diplomatic front when it comes to Kashmir?
I mean, Israel takes a position that that's an integral part of India.
Right.
So Kashmir is part of India for the Israelis, like many other countries in the world. So there's nothing unique about that. But an interesting story is that, you have 370 that was abrogated in 2019, Article 370, Article 35A. But I came across, someone actually showed this information to me from the early 90s, was that when Shimon Peres went to India in the early 90s, he actually, suggested that India basically revoke Article 370 and basically start that process of integrating Kashmir into India. So this is not to say that they got the idea from the Israelis necessarily, because they've been doing this kind of project for the last 70 years, like slowly integrating Kashmir in different ways. But for the Israelis, Kashmir is basically the lab in which India gets to practice with Israeli weapons, and not just Israeli weapons, with Israeli methodology. So you'll see that some of the things that are taking place in Kashmir will eventually, or actually they've already started, but eventually make their way into mainland India in terms of blocking how people, are
Like we
able
saw
to-
with the farmers' protests in Punjab.
farmers' protests. For instance, in 2018, you had the Great March of Return protests in Gaza by the fence, right?
Yes.
And it's a peaceful protest. People just want to go back to their homes, right? In now southern Israel, and what you have is that the Israelis start using these drones to fire on. They use drones to fire tear gas on the protesters, and 6 years later, the farmers are moving from Haryana to Delhi to protest for better, rewards for the yield
Against
right?
a particular law that they were trying to pass.
Yeah, right. And so that's taking place, and the Haryana police start using drones to fire tear gas on farmers.
yeah.
So on the surface, you could say, okay, they are using the same technique, fine. But you dig deeper, you actually realize that they are actually using Israeli techniques.
The little
because
same technology,
not necessarily. I mean, I think those drones were built in India,
Probably, yeah.
but the time in which, the period in which the Israelis were using those drones in Israel, in Gaza, right? The Haryana chief minister and the head of police were in Israel studying law and order issues, going to the factories, going into the aerospace,
Defense
services,
contractors trying to
and
see.
basically studying how they are dealing with dissent.
So
So
basically,
essentially, they
policing a quote unquote hostile population.
yeah, and so this is not like they watched it on the news and decided that they're going to follow it. This is about them studying it directly. So in that way, there are so many examples, of
Direct technology transfers.
direct technology. For instance, you also have in the early 2000s, Advani, right, going from India, going to Israel, and then studying the sort of smart border integrated fences that the Israelis use. And several years later, you see that these are the fences that they're putting on the LOC, on the line of control as well.
Yes.
So it's a direct sort of correlation.
Direct comparison and correlation. But on the global stage, don't India and Israel run the risk of losing a lot of political capital and clout because they are now both complicit in local domestic genocides? We've seen online there's been a lot of backlash on all spectrums in different countries, all over the world. The ruling classes, that's not what I'm speaking about, but the average public. There's even been, for example, that has translated into the HB1 visa issue as well in America, where Indian workers coming to replace local American workers is seen as a sort of existential threat and crisis now. And they're pointing towards Israel, by the way, and saying that, this is what they've done over there. And they even point to the fact that India and Israel seem to enjoy this special relationship with each other. Why is it that they're so willing and open now in this relationship? Is it just the Abraham Accords? Are they playing a gambit? Because they're running a big risk potentially, because the Muslim world can bounce back in a second, and relationships can sour with Israel. Why is it they're so confident in their openness of the relationship now?
So fascist regimes are always overconfident, right? Hitler said he'll rule for 1,000 years. Likewise, the Israelis and Netanyahu in particular feel some type of confidence that they're going to get away with this. So you're right that this is a gamble, especially for the Indians. But there's a lot of things happening simultaneously to India moving towards Israel. One is that there seems to be a sense that the U.S. Power is diminishing, right? So we feel that it's diminishing. So when we look at India and Israel, India moving closer to Israel, and therefore the U.S. as well, you think, okay, are you sure you want to be doing that when the U.S. is losing, right? Or at least decreasing or diminishing in strength. But is it really diminishing in strength?
It's more of a perceived,
right? It's potentially diminishing, but as it is now, Israel does not really have a good reputation amongst most countries or many countries in the world, and it's only the U.S. that's propping it up, right? And so what I mean by this is that the U.S. still has a lot of power,
without a doubt,
right? And India is hedging its bets, right, being close to Israel. But it's doing that while simultaneously presenting and projecting itself as a non-aligned partner. So what it's done is that it's moved towards Israel, but it's told the U.S. that we are not going to support your war against Russia, right? When it comes to Ukraine. So it creates this barrier in which...
Even with Azerbaijan and Armenia, it provided aid for an armament for Armenia.
So it presents itself to the global south in a particular way and it ticks those boxes that it's saying that, no, look, we are not supporting the US or imperial interests, right? We're not going to jump on the bandwagon and go after Russia, right? And when it comes to Israel, we're going to be doing this because it's in our national interest to do so. And so they are pushing it, or they're presenting themselves as taking this sort of middle path, but they're not exactly doing so. They are taking sides here, obviously. Now, there's a second element to this, is that why they are able to do so is because India is also being seen as the potential new factory of the world. So you have...
They've done the test run with the iPhone as well.
Yeah. I mean, everything is moving, not everything is moving away from China, but, China might have reached sort of like a peak in a way. And a lot of the goods are now being taken to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, as well as to India. And with so much of emphasis being placed on AI as well, right? India is soon going to have the biggest
audience.
Not just the audience, but number of workers who are trained in AI.
Right, yeah.
So which means that whether you like India or not, whether they are involved in these things or not, whether they are suppressing their own minorities within India or whether they are conducting ethnic cleansing in Kashmir, for instance, it doesn't matter because the Americans or the Europeans need Indian labor.
And you've already seen the flashpoint with the crisis of the H-1B, the visas, where they want to keep importing Indian skilled labor.
Well, to be honest, I haven't come to a full understanding of this point, because it's a very fascinating issue, because you have right-wing, MAGA supporters who are going after sort of upper caste, Brahmins, who are also importing Hindutva into the US.
Yes.
So sort of like these two right-wing, it's like a civil war within the right wing.
Also, some of the left-wing, even Bernie Sanders comment on it, and he said that this was a way to suppress domestic workers' wages by importing labor. Even some of the more economically inclined left is critical of this decision by billionaires like Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy. Again, sort of an actual Brahmin and then white Brahmin, Elon Musk.
Yeah.
You're compatriot, right? You're countrymen. Yeah.
No, but that goes to the point where we are living in an age of oligarchies, aren't we?
Right.
So there's
The elite globally has sort of found each other and
they found
started
each
to
other.
collude. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is what it's about. So the elite want those workers to come in, right? They want them because
And
it's
manage gas
cheaper.
stations and motels.
Well, the H1B1 is not necessarily about that, right? I
A
mean,
lot
it
of them,
isn't about
a lot
that.
of them end up managing gas stations and hotels.
Yeah. So as I said, like this particular H1B1 thing is something I have to look deeper into, because at this point it seems like this ridiculous war between two right wings, essentially.
But even the populist sentiment that is in the sort of the public sphere, the average voter has started to figure out this kind of, even on the far right, for example, who classically would have opposed this due to more racially inclined regions. The anti-immigration would have been more racially inclined. It is now based on pure economics. They're also seeing that their replacement by a global elite, whether that be in India or China or America. So isn't that also a big risk that India, which touts itself as the biggest democracy, as the most populous democracy, that these popular sentiments will catch on domestically as well, where they will start to see India as at least the management as an exploitative entity.
That management in the US would see.
But the local population in India will start to see the Indian state as an exploitative entity.
I think I I think many I think there are many people in India who see that already. I think the unions see it, the farmers see it. That's why they are standing up for their rights. But if they are able to create a Muslim boogeyman, or they're able to create other kinds of othering, right? That gives them the impression that this is the only way to go up on the ladder. Then this is how they will continue to win over their votes, or they win over people. But to me, at least, it's pretty obvious that India has not been able to. You spoke about the workers going to Israel. Why are Indians, construction workers or caregivers wanting to go to Israel in a country that's completely so unstable, right?
It's in a state of war.
In a state of war, right? Why? Because there aren't opportunities at the bottom in India. So you have this impression that that the economy is growing, it's becoming so big, but it doesn't really protect the poor or the underclass, or it doesn't really create. It's not creating jobs. It's only creating jobs in a particular sector. So yes, there may be a time where people will understand that, but at this point, it's still going on.
You mentioned the framework of the narrative of Islamophobia or hatred towards Muslims as the Muslim boogeyman. We've all seen it online at this point. I think even Europeans and Americans know about it. Everybody knows the joke that 99.99% of anti-Muslim posts are generated in India. Right, the statistics are out. A lot of internet survey companies have said that a lot of the anti-Islamic rhetoric that comes out online is primarily from India. They use that for domestic politics. That is also translated into a hatred for the Palestinians somehow. They've equated this domestic threat of Muslims in India and Pakistan all the way into Palestine. How does that work out when you have such a sizable Muslim population?
In India?
Yes.
How does it work out?
Yes. Where do you think it's going?
Well, okay, so we have to take a step back and understand why there is this machinery of Islamophobia in India, and how it matches or how it fits into the state narrative. So when October 7 took place, you had a wave of disinformation coming out of Israel, and the Indians jumped on board, pushing the idea of Hamas committing these horrors, right?
They still push it, by the way.
Right? And you had all these influencers and all these
Hindutva influencers are still pushing it. Do you know any of them?
Say again?
Do you know any of them by name?
Personally?
No. Do you know? Can you recognize them? The different.
I can recognize them. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. There's that one Kashyap. I think this is a journalist. Has a funny name. This is Abhijit Nayyar.
Yeah. He's
so there's I know them by their characters. There's a gay atheist. Then there's a science guy, Bill Nye,
Yeah.
the Hindutva, the science guy character they have, who's an atheist, but he's Hindutva.
Yeah.
And then there's one guy who's a Buddhist, but he's Hindutva. And they have like this whole team of Power Rangers.
Yeah.
And they still push the 7th of October narrative.
Yeah, they push it because what they're trying to do is that they're trying to create the narrative that if you support the Palestinians, then you are actually going against the Indian state. Because the idea is that India is so close to Israel now, because we're not just, we're not just matching up as a state in terms of the civilizational history, right? Because this is where the connections between Hindutva and Zionism come in. It's the idea that, because these outsiders came in, namely Muslims, these great civilizations were destroyed. Right? So now we are facing the same enemy, right? And so if you support the Palestinians, then you're basically being anti-national towards...
Because then in a roundabout way, you're supporting the Muslims who are invaders and they're foreigners.
Exactly.
Right.
And so what that means is that you don't have to be Muslim in India to feel suffocated in that way. Because what that means is that if you push for Palestinian rights, then you will fall outside the ambit of Hindu nationalism. Just like if you are a Jewish person and you're not supporting Israel, then you're anti-Zionist, then you're not part of the Jewish state. Also, you are anti-Semitic. You're an anti-Semitic, self-hating Jew.
Yes.
Right? So they are suffocating,
their own sort of population as well.
They're suffocating the population to create a kind of, monotheist type of idea, right? In which you can be atheist, you can be whatever, right? But if you follow the dear leader, then you're going to be part of that economic sort of like promise as well. So
There's a cast of characters now. So there's Modi, there's Trump, there's Orban, Viktor Orban, there's Nigel Farage, there's Netanyahu, and they all seem to be internationally, communicating, having relationships, increasing trade and what have you. Trump seems to be the wild card amongst all of them. What do you think America's relationship with Israel and India is going to be? Because you had those... Is there not a disappointment on the American security states front with regards to India's mission for the containment of China? Don't they have those complaints with the Indians?
They have complaints with... You're asking if they have complaints with India with regards to...
The containment of China.
I think... No, I mean, I think the first part is that I'm not into predictions.
No, I need a prediction.
That's not my thing. Secondly, I think that you can tell from Trump's movements in the last few months, in which he's surrounding himself with particular characters who are also linked to the Indian state.
Tulsi Gabbard, Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yeah, and there are others. There's also the Kash Patel.
Right? Oh God, yeah, Kash Patel. I forgot.
And so they are vicious characters that are part, and so essentially Trump, you could also tell from the language that he's using or has been using, is that he has somewhat, at least publicly, come across as a bit more sober. Right?
This time around,
right?
yeah.
And so he may understand that there are a little of a balancing act that countries have to play. So long as India ticks those boxes that he needs ticked, then I think we're going to see the actual amplification of Modi's tactics and crass behavior towards Muslims and other minorities in India under this Trump administration. So even though Biden did nothing really publicly, I think there was an attempt behind the scenes to maybe talk about what's happening in India.
There was indirect pressure put on India via Canada with the arrests and the murder of Hari Singh.
Now you have someone like Kash Patel running one of the top agencies.
Yes.
Right? Then that kind of leverage disappears.
In terms of Trump coming into office and he's presenting this sober face, he has people like Kash Patel, he has these characters around him. Do you think there's going to be a doubling down now on the side of India and with regards to the situation in Gaza and with the Western world with regards to the situation in Kashmir, where they're going to double down on this negligent attitude towards this genocide and ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, so again, it's hard to say what India is going to do next, but it does appear that there will be no backtracking in the way they have dealt with this, right? So for your listeners, right, it's we can talk about what has happened over the past year. India originally did not support the first like ceasefire call at the UN. It was just a humanitarian pause that they were calling for, right? 2 months later, it supports a humanitarian pause as well as a ceasefire. So it's kind of does so begrudgingly, right? It's not really that interested in it. The key part here now is that the South Africa takes Israel to the ICJ, and the ICJ rules that there's somewhat like a plausible genocide, back in January, taking place in Gaza. India does not support the ICJ case. Later, when there's a call for an embargo on Israeli weapons, or on being like supplying weapons to Israel, India does not support that. When there's a warrant now put out
by the ICC
on Netanyahu and a few others,
and Galant,
India does not support that. But instead, what it says is that it's in their it's so long as it's in their national interest to be conducting this type of trade with Israel, it'll continue to do so. And so that's where the signal is. If they feel that that Israel's going to get away with all of this, and they need to continue, it's in their national interest to continue showing support, then they're going to continue to do so. And the second part of this is that it also shows, like the US, because India actually wants to become like the US. That's the point here. It wants to become the superpower. It talks about itself in that way. And becoming a superpower means that you show disregard for international law as well. So there's no interest from India to respect the ICJ or to respect the ICC, because they're not signatories to those things in the first place. So they're not interested in it. So their point is that, and this is where it becomes very interesting, because to go back to one of your earlier questions, in that it does not necessarily see, hedging its bets with Israel as actually hedging its bets, because Israel has been able to get away with marketing itself as a democracy. And so India also feels that so long as you market yourself or project yourself or have certain elements to suggest that democracy, then you're going to get away with a lot of things. Now, the idea about why is it that you get away as a democracy is because you essentially suggest to the world that you have the internal mechanisms to self-correct. And that's the point here. That they are saying we don't need an ICJ or an ICC to come in, because we have a judiciary. We're not a dictatorship. We have a judiciary, we have a media, we have a civil society. And in actual fact, they don't have any of those things now.
It's a rigged game, yeah.
Yeah, and so essentially they are going to double down. In many ways, they're going to double down. Basically, they won't change anything unless they feel under threat. And so if the US changes its policy towards Israel, that's when India will change its policy.
Coming to the internet, there is an idea that Hasbra is sort of the inspiration for the Hindutva style propaganda, online IT farm stuff, the Twitter activism, a lot of the social media, sort of the meme, right? The full support guy, the vivid prowess kind of guy, the fake account that's complaining about having to go to a bunker in Tel Aviv, but it's some guy in Bihar or UP or something. What is Hasbara and the initial investments that Israel made into IT, into online trolling and controlling the narrative online? Is that the ancestor of Hindutva online presence? Is that the sort of the spiritual predecessor? Is there evidence to show that there was training or sharing of technologies in that matter?
Yeah, there's with a lot of these things, there aren't necessarily a direct line to say, okay, here's how Israel started with its Hasbara in terms of online, and India necessarily or
picked it up, like with the case of the drones, right? In the gas, but
there are many signals of those of it being copycat. For instance, in 2001, there was a Hindu nationalist website in the US, and it basically was shut down right? Because of complaints by Indians living in the US that basically said that, this website's creating a kind of like a hit list against those who are speaking up against Hindutva, right? And so the service provider took on those complaints and shut down the website. Now, that Hindu nationalist went to a Zionist in New York, and he got that Zionist to help him get that site back up.
Right.
So, like that, there are many kind of connections. There are many connections in which you see sort of like this copycat behavior. Now, if you take it a little further, we don't have to even talk about the digital connections. We can talk about actual lobbying connections.
Sure.
So, for example, you have all these lobbying groups in the U.S. that push, Israeli talking points, and so that has been going on for decades, right? And Hindu nationalists basically worked with organizations like APAC, with the AJC, with the ADL, directly towards creating kind of talking points, on the same wavelength of those Israeli Zionist talking points.
For the Hindutva lobby.
For the Hindutva lobby, right? And so then that essentially became, especially in the US at least, it became the way in which those points were then, or those methodologies were then copied, because then you have similar kinds of techniques. So for instance, they'll tackle curriculums at the university. They'll say, okay, you know what, this is not South Asia. This is actually India, right? This is our greater India, just as you have greater Israel, right? You can't use certain words. So for example, if you talk about Israel being an apartheid state, then you'll be accused of being anti-Semitic.
Right.
So if you talk about Hindu nationalism being right-wing or being pushing
fascistic or racist,
then you'll be,
Hinduphobic.
So that's the kind of language that's been created, and then obviously that's been then translated onto digital platforms because that's where people are, right? So yes, there is a direct line, and in that way, you see these organizations having partnerships or meeting each other, especially after 2019. A lot of groups met each other in the US, for instance.
Right, and now you even saw that in the protests that take place, the counter protests that the Zionists do in New York and other places, you'll always have Hindutva right-wing sort of guys with Indian flags as well. And they'll be chanting the popular Jai Shri Ram and other kinds of chants that are used to torment Muslims in lynch mobs and these kinds of pogroms in India.
Yeah.
How has that been perceived by the average, do you think, Indian citizen, the more sort of centered or center-left citizen who is not with the Hindutva program?
In India or in the US?
In India, as well as the Indian diaspora, which is sizable in Europe and America as well. Has there been pushback from them, or is there a silence because there's fear for, recourse back home to punish them in that way?
So it's a mixed bag. For instance, in the US, if you're a younger person, if you're a student involved in Palestine protests, you're going to be very embarrassed by those flags, by those connections that you see Hindu nationalists coming and supporting Israel, because it's kind of you are supporting Palestine and then your community coming out and supporting Israel. It doesn't make any sense. So there is a pushback amongst younger Indians in the US. Not necessarily a huge pushback, but there is pushback that's taking place, or at least there's a reckoning that's taking place. In terms of the older generation, I think many of them see it through the prism of that Israel is India's partner and opportunity to modernize. So they look at it through that prism in which they see Muslims as backward, right, in the Middle East as well as in India. So in this case, it means that there's going to be some collateral damage in order for us to improve our country.
Right.
So they kind of like shut down their kids to say, you know what, you guys are being idealistic and all of that. It's a shame, perhaps, that this is happening, but it has to happen. So they see it through that lens. That,
The developmentalism for the sake of progress.
for the
we
sake
have
of
to-
progress, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the third lot who's like clearly super Islamophobic and saying that, these guys are just civilizationally like inferior, and it doesn't really matter. So there are these kind of distinctions that are present. You do get a sense that people are afraid because Indians in the US in particular want to go back to India to visit. If they're identified
Own real
online, then
estate.
they don't get
They have
their-
families there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you get stories all the time of like the police going to their parents to visit.
To harass
or
them,
going-
yeah.
And I mean, Kashmiri is
So
Kashmiri is
transnational
facing
repression,
most.
basically.
Yeah, and so this type of story is like foundational to the Indian, the modern Indian state in that way. In that you got to project yourself. You got to be a sort of an ambassador for India abroad. And if you don't behave in a particular way, then there are going to be consequences and repercussions for you. So Kashmir is at the top of that list.
A lot of Israeli propaganda, even prior to October the 7th, was anti-immigrant in Europe and in America. It was, a lot of the right wing was pushing this. And the point of the anti-immigrant narrative was that Muslim immigration is bad. Now, because of the color of our skin and the stupidity of our opponents, what ends up happening is that sentiment translated into anti-Indian immigration as well. How does the Israeli propaganda now function with this fine line of that you can't immigrate Muslims to the Western world, but you can get Indian immigrants there?
Well, I think, so like this, in many ways, this anti-Indian immigrant story, right? As I said to you earlier, we're still trying to figure out the full dimensions of this. But I, at this point, see it as a kind of like storm in a teacup, in a way. Because there is a distinction that's made by both the liberal, like left, as well as the centrist, as well as the right, between Indians, right, which is to say Hindu Indians, right, and Muslims. And that's because of the ability of Indians to be to assimilate into like Western society in a way. And so there's a way of seeing Indians as a type of Vivek Ramaswamy type, where
Right.
you project yourself
As white.
as white, you're white adjacent. And there are many people who have gone to the US and to other parts of the West who are upper caste,
Brahmins,
Indians, right?
yeah.
They've gone there and they have basically slipped into those
White spaces, white adjacent spaces,
and,
right?
and when it comes to the diet, when it comes to the way they
Lifestyle.
behave, lifestyle, they're able to embody that. So they're not a threat in the way Muslims are seen as a threat.
Right.
So I don't think there's a distinction in that way. So for me, like anyone who's talking about, and I said I reserve the right to like change my mind on this because I'm trying to figure it out still. But I still see this as a kind of two types of right wingers as privileged, entitled societies having a bit of a civil war in a way. And so I don't think Israel needs to do anything ultimately. And Israel actually makes fun of Indians all the time.
Online, yeah.
Because there is no respect. It's a racist society. So, and there's a desperation on the Indian side to get out or to find jobs or to earn in foreign currency or whatever it is, right? Or to be close to the exotic, right?
Right.
So I don't think there's really a battle there. I don't think there's a fine line, essentially. The Muslim, there's so much of propaganda and so much of
From the war on terror
on the world
days, the
regards
leftover,
to,
yeah.
to just make that distinction. I mean, we're talking about so many of the big firms in the US, whether it's Google, whether it's IBM, whether it is Apple. These are all led by Indians. They are part of the system. They're part of the mainstream. So you can't dislodge that with a couple of fights over Twitter.
I would disagree because I think there is an undercurrent, a dissatisfaction and a sentiment in the American right wing, especially in the average public, and especially in the younger generations, where it's anti-immigrant sentiment right now, but on a larger scale, it's never-ending war in the Middle East. It's interventionism. It's too much immigration. It's foreign aid programs. It's military bases abroad. It's a lot of different things, which is a dissatisfaction with the quality of life in America. It has stemmed from student loans, the healthcare crisis, the issue of joblessness, the weakening of the American purchasing power. While you're right, this particular issue is something that will come and go. But long term, I think that there is going to be a sentiment amongst this public. We already see a congruence even on the left and the right amongst the younger voters, where they have a disdain and a disgust for Israel and its activities in Gaza and Palestine. And I think that India is running the risk of attracting that Western attention towards itself as well, which it historically has not had that kind of heat.
No, I don't disagree that in the long term, it may happen, but not now.
Right, it's too short of a timeline to,
Even when it comes to Israel, Israel still enjoys a lot of support in the US.
Without a doubt, yes.
Right? So if we're going to pretend that there's some kind of revolution going to take place on the ground, no, it's not going to happen. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are Indians controlling the machinery for the narrative.
It's such a funny concept, by the way.
I mean, that's
what
true. It is.
It's true.
So yes, there may be a time in which Indians will be seen as the entitled brats that are controlling us in a way.
Right? They'll fit into that narrative.
Right? They may be seen as that at some point, but we're not there.
Not there yet.
When people think about India, we're talking about, I mean, I hate repeating this, but we're still talking about Bollywood. We're still talking about yoga. We're still talking about Indian food, even if there's better food, right? We are still thinking about India in those terms. We're also thinking about Indians as benign actors. We're not thinking of them as aggressive actors. If you think of Muslims, you think of Muslims as aggressive.
That's the branding.
As being a threat.
That's the PR, yeah.
There's no threat of the Indian guy is still the one.
Low testosterone, sort of.
Exactly. Asexual, right? Like Raj in a TV show, right? Who's going to be the one fixing your tech. He's the one helping you. He's your service provider. That's how the Indian is seen. The Muslim is seen as the one that's there to change to take away your lifestyle. Yeah. Essentially. So no, we're far away from that.
You think this? It's still in the works, but it's not.
I think any thinking human being should be seeing the rise of India, especially in terms of how it's projecting itself and how it's also joining hands with these other fascist states and becoming very close to these huge companies and creating this billionaire class as seen as a threat to the universe, to the planet. It's a crisis that we are in, and India is not exactly taking the world in a positive direction, right? But we are talking about decades of soft power
and propaganda that has been fed to the average public.
I mean, to dislodge that. I mean, to take it back to the discussion about Palestine and to discussion about Kashmir. Kashmir doesn't factor in any.
No, it's not in the popular narrative.
And Indian Muslims don't factor in any manner as well. I mean, to bring it back again even further is that when you think of Muslims and India, right, in the US, people don't associate Muslims with India. Muslims are with Pakistan or Afghanistan
in the Middle East,
else, right? In the Middle East, they're not part of India. So that's also part of the success of the Hindu nationalist, narrative, but even beyond the Hindu nationalist narrative, that's sort of like left center Indian narrative.
Nehruvian India
as well, right?
It's successfully publicly removed the image of Islamic involvement or Muslim involvement in India.
Yeah. So
the Taj Mahal is not seen as a Muslim cultural project. The average Western audience suspects it's just Indian.
Yeah.
Which is just like a vague blanket term that they use.
Yeah.
Right. So here there is still attitudes in Pakistan where they still talk about the PLO, They still talk about Yasser Arafat. Our liberal intelligentsia still mentions Nehruvian India and how these were great allies, and we didn't understand them, and we weren't able to, and that providing this religious identity to our emancipation struggles, whether they're Kashmiri or whether they're Palestinian, this is the source of the problem. In fact, one of our religious, proselytizers, public proselytizers, wrote an article recently that the Muslim personification of our political struggles has been our downfall. If we can somehow secularize them as ethnic or linguistic or territorial struggles, that would be better off for us. How do you view this kind of talk? And he specifically said this in the context recently, and is very touted for this in the context of Kashmir and Palestine.
Well, I mean, there's this is like a tough circle to sort of like to square in a way.
Yeah.
Because there's this idea of what Nehru meant, what Gandhi meant, and yet there's all these other facts that we just don't have. For example, Gandhi said specific things about Palestine in the late 30s, but by the late 40s, his mind sort of seemed to have also changed on it. It's like I think there's a quote that attributed to him saying that if the Arabs have a right, the Jews have a prior right, to that land. So there's a lot of ambiguity, right, regarding these things.
It seems to be a purposeful ambiguity.
Of course, you can say that also. There is a purposeful ambiguity, and yeah, I guess that's correct. There is a purposeful ambiguity, and that ambiguity also falls into how the story of India is also told. So India is sold to us as a kind of this secular state, but the state is also very Hinduized,
and always has been.
And always has been. I mean, if you think of go to a simple example of an actor like Dilip Kumar. Why does he change his name from Yusuf Khan to Dilip Kumar at that time, right? There's all these examples that suggest that you got to survive in this landscape, you got to be adjacent, to the national project, which is pretty much Hindu. And so the story, the story of the Nehruvian agenda also excludes other inconvenient things like Hyderabad that takes place, or the special laws that are kind of implemented in the Northeast, right? You have Kashmir that has all these troops that being sent in, right?
1 troop for every 10 people.
Yeah, absolutely. So like how you that's why I say it's like a circle you want to square. It's like you want to talk about yourself as a democracy, but you have an occupation.
Right? In multiple territories in India.
And multiple territories, right? And so, I think there's a nostalgia, right?
For Bollywood India.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also not helped by the intelligentsia not being honest.
Being disingenuous, in my opinion. I think they're being disingenuous at times, especially in Pakistan. Because it's a way to browbeat Muslims and conservatives, I feel like.
I mean, you would know better than me. But absolutely, it's disingenuous. And it also doesn't help Indian Muslims in India also reimagine their
role in their society.
Because also it's kind of like the situation is so bad that they will have some kind of thirst for the past in a way, as if that was so much better.
Do you have a Twitter?
Yeah.
Are you ready for them?
They can come. It's fine. But I mean, this nostalgia is a problem because you asked me prior to us talking,
yes,
why I focused on this book.
Yes.
I focused on Hindutva and Zionism. Like, how do I get there? And part of the issue is that I'm from South Africa, brought up on a diet of that nostalgia. So my grandparents are from India, and then you brought up with the idea that India stands for all of these things, when actually, what exactly does it stand for? You got to figure out. And so that set me on a path to figure out what is Kashmir about. And then reporting from Kashmir, then reporting from Kashmir, then reporting at Al Jazeera. and writing about Palestine and then visiting Palestine and then seeing these connections and then noticing how even if the story of Palestine, the situation in Palestine is not changing, it's actually getting worse, but there's still an acknowledgement of a colonial project there amongst so many people in the world. But when it comes to Kashmir, there's not even that, right? And so then trying to understand, not trying to say that, one deserves more attention than the other, but the point being that why is it that we're not able to see
I was speaking with brother Muzammil. He's a Kashmiri activist, Muzammil Ayub, and he said that Kashmir seems to have a PR and branding problem. It gets drowned out by Indian branding and propaganda. And he said this in the most cynical terms. And I think he's right, that Kashmir needs a rebrand. It needs to be recognized globally as Palestine is, as a colonial project taken on by ex-colonists, people who were colonized, and now then they became the colonizers. That's what he described them as.
So he says who should be responsible
the
for
Kashmiri people need to, and then anyone who's interested in the cause of Kashmir needs to.
So if you're living in Kashmir,
exactly,
like what are you supposed to do? Like your
No, he's a Kashmiri activist outside of Kashmir. Obviously, he didn't say this as a
I understand
as a slight.
But I'm just saying like that's fair. You can say that it needs a rebrand, right? But you're living in Kashmir, like the situation is that you can't report.
No internet, not this, not that, the other.
The internet is slowed. Everyone's being watched. You can't speak openly. You're being flooded with outsiders coming in and influences showing Kashmir in its infinite beauty. And then the world is not going to understand there's a different type of colonization taking place there.
Soft colonization.
Yeah. There's the influencer colonization.
Colonization, bringing in alcohol, bringing in tourists. Like they buy like a dozen white tourists a year and they send them to Kashmir. They get celebrities. Recently, it was quite tragic with Diljit Dosanjh, who's a very popular Punjabi folk singer and hip hop singer and R&B. People he postured as a sort of Khalistan, pro-Punjab, pro-farmers, anti-Hindutva character, but then, when he becomes very successful, he just shows up in Kashmir, and what does that do? Why is it? A lot of people don't understand what the big problem with these kinds of things are. What is that doing when he shows up in Kashmir? What is that doing really? This is the part that people don't grasp.
Well, he's doing a couple of things. One of it is he's creating desire for the place. And that's part of the colonial story.
It's making it exotic and a tourist. Yeah.
Right? And you're also showing you are creating belonging. Also, you're making Kashmir into a possession, essentially.
Right.
So you're going there and you're being taken on a manicured path, right? And
by the state,
by the state, and you presented sort of like these little symbols of like cultural sort of like
enrichment and
affinity, and so the people become placeholders essentially, and that's what it is. So you go there and you present Kashmir in this way, and you are to use your words, disingenuous. It's like there's literally
thousands of people,
a gun behind those people's backs,
yeah,
and then they are forced to smile
at you, right? And serve you food or whatever.
And this is ridiculous, right?
Yeah, it's like visiting a prison population as a tourist destination.
And then essentially, and then also marketing yourself as sort of like being so humane as well. Like you're going to this place.
This is a similarity between Israel and Palestine, where Israel uses the religious tourism, attracts Zionist Christians, and
of which Muslims also fall
prey to.
Muslims in Pakistan, I'm sure, South Africa as well.
Pakistani expats. Because we can't go to Israel.
Because of the passport?
Yeah. We can't go.
So they
expats go and they do tours and
foreign passports. Yeah, right.
Because they're idiots.
Yeah. So they go there and then project this wonderful place, right?
Yes.
And it creates an idea of normalization.
Yes.
That's the point. It's about normalizing.
Both India and in Israel has been spending a lot of money on influencers. Yeah. So Israel has the right of return, and then they also pay influencers online to come and visit Israel for free, and then just to post glowing reviews about them. India is doing the same in Kashmir.
Israel also uses Christian Zionists to come in.
They have
to come for these pilgrimage.
they have tour groups, yeah?
Yeah, so and that's part of the Hasbara, part of the plan. You go to like countries around the world in which they have sizable Christian populations who have some, obviously, a connection with
yes.
the idea of Jerusalem, right? Bethlehem, the land of Jesus,
Yes.
And then you go in and you essentially create a manicured path for them, and the whole settler colonial project, the apartheid situation is pushed to the side, and then they go back and talk about this great land, which is like doing very well, clean streets, all of that, and that's like one element, right? And the other element is that when Netanyahu went to when Netanyahu went to India, he also met with like the Bollywood crew, and part of that was it fits into this Diljit story as well, like in which you are trying to get Indian cinema, or in particular Bollywood or the popular cinema, to go to Israel and then film your shots or your music videos or whatever.
Make productions together, yeah.
And then you kind of create, you kind of change the public perception of what Israel looks like.
Yes.
So then Israel looks like a modern.
At the 7th of
state,
October,
right?
Mainstream Indian TV was right there immediately, reporting on ground. There are a lot of mainstream TV anchors reporting from Israel, they were wearing helmets and vests like real war correspondents do. Like they were playing pretend.
Yeah.
And they were sort of ducking under the rocket fire
like
coming.
the CNN report.
Yeah, they were coming. The rocket fire, the bottle rockets that Hamas fires.
Yeah, fireworks.
Yeah, fireworks that they fire.
Yeah.
And Israel. And they were acting like they were doing duck and covers. And there's one other aspect that tends to get ignored. I don't know if you fully covered it in your book. Is that there is a common trend I've seen that Israel does, as well as the Indian authorities. They sexualize Kashmiri and Palestinian women. You saw that with the IDF, for example, that they were publicizing photos of women's underwear in Palestinian homes in Gaza. And with Kashmir, it's something that, because I speak Urdu and you're in the culture because you're Indian adjacent or whatever. The way the Kashmiri women are sexualized, and there's a particular notion of, I don't want to get into the specifics, it's very graphic and disgusting. How does that's not something they learned, but it's common between both of them.
So that is common, and it's also common amongst all kind of colonial
projects, right?
So that's why it's important to like connect these things, but also understand that they are part of larger connections as well. It's not just about India and Israel being. They
happen independently, right?
And so yes, there is a sexualization, and it goes back to even Nehru. Nehru writes about. I think he describes Kashmir as a woman, right? And so it's kind of like a woman to be won, to win over. Right?
From her husband. While her husband wins over boys.
While her
husband wins over little boys.
Right.
She gets it. Nehru had a love affair
with his wife,
and Lord Mountbatten was a boy lover.
Okay, I didn't know about that.
Was a famous pedophile. The CIA and the FBI were profiling him, and they knew that he was a boy lover.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then he was killed by the IRA in a.
Yeah, he was killed by the IRA.
The IRA.
Yeah.
It was actually it was the British state, but anyways. Okay. So yeah.
What else is there to say? Like when 2019 took place, this sort of language and this type of disgusting exotification of Kashmiri women as well, reached its peak because it was also part of that colonial idea of trying to like civilize the place and also protecting,
these women,
like taking away these women from these horrific men,
the savages,
the savages. We're gonna save them, and it's also linked to it's just linked to the colonial thing. And then the Israelis do that all the time. The US did the same thing when they were going into Afghanistan, as well. They're going to bring democracy and they're going to save
women's education and women's rights and what have you.
So it's the thing with some of the stuff is that, to be quite honest, it's actually very boring in that way. It's like these guys are not innovative.
No, it's the same.
ideas
Yeah,
that
there's
they are
nothing
using.
new.
This is stuff that's been used for decades, right? Maybe even centuries, right? And so the Indians are just following that model. It's really boring in that way. So I think-
Right, sir. Full support for the book, Hostile Homelands. It's a beautiful book by our brother Azad Essa. And full support, sir. But for the sake of the dinner not getting cold, we're going to have to end this discussion. Thank you for coming, brother.
Thank you.
If we will have any questions, we can ask you and then we can take you up online, inshallah.
Okay, sure.
Thank
Thank you
you,
for
Azad.
talking with me.